first it was Chloe who gazumped us. Then it was Guyon Espiner. Guyon Espiner gazumped us and got Gary Stevenson on.
Gary!
A very good interview. You should go and check it out. The first half of it is basically all talking about Gary's story, who he is, what he does, how long he's been doing it, all that kind of stuff based on his book. The second half, they get into a little bit more conversation around economies and especially New Zealand's economy. So let's start with, these are all only kind of 60-second or so clips. I've got 3 of them. Let's have a look at the first one. The first one is Gary talking about, why people don't spend more money. Like, it's a question to ask people, why don't you spend more money? Why aren't you spending more money? Why don't you spend more money? And that's a part of this conversation.
Why do you advocate for a wealth tax?
I think if you don't do anything, if you leave the system...
Sorry, I read the wrong cue. This one's about a wealth tax, just in case that was unclear. Why do you advocate for it? That's what we're doing.
I think if you don't do anything, if you leave the system as it is, then wealth inequality will increase very rapidly. That's not an abstract concept. What that means is the rich get richer and richer and everybody else loses their assets. What that means is ordinary families can't afford to buy homes. Ordinary families need to take enormous amounts of debt. It means the bankrupting of governments, which means the shutting down of welfare states. I mean, we're seeing that very visibly now here in the UK. I think in the absence of action, you will see really, really rapid increases in poverty. And we're seeing that here in the UK, and I'm pretty confident.
That's a really important point. He comes back to time and again, is the absence of action. That something needs to happen now, or this is going to be what happens.
And you're also seeing that over there in New Zealand. So staying with the status quo, I think, is not going to work. We have a tax system in most countries, definitely over here, and I'm pretty sure over there as well, where we tax working people pretty aggressively, pretty high rates, and yet the very wealthiest in our country often inherit billions and pay nothing. If you don't do anything about that, it is pretty obviously going to take you to a situation where in the long run, working families lose their homes, the government loses its assets, and everything is owned by the very rich. I would encourage, the Kiwi public out there to read their history books about what history was like in Europe. Thousands of years of desperate poverty surrounding a tiny, super, super wealthy elite. If we don't do anything, that's where we go.
Okay.
And of course, you don't have that history of inequality, but you'll have that future if you don't do something, and so will we.
Yeah.
So, we know that Gary doesn't pull punches. And the idea of action now is it is strong within him. He is strong within the force about action. I'm just going to go through these clips, AJ, if you want to jump in. But
go for it.
The next conversation he has is he's talking about capital flight, and the question that Guyon asks is about capital flight, which is, of course, just simply when you hear people on the right going, well, if you change the tax system, all the rich people will leave. And Gary explains why that doesn't really matter, like I've never heard before. It's a very interesting explanation to do with the assets when they leave, that they still leave in a country that will then still be taxed. So it's a really interesting thought.
Yeah, I think capital flight is a legitimate risk. I think it's a legitimate risk, but it's something that we can deal with. It's something we can deal with. I think governments like to pretend you can't tax billionaires, because if you tax them, they'll leave. But the interesting thing about billionaires is they own your country. And what I mean is they own your land, and they own your buildings, and they own your mortgages, and they own your government debt. If we were to bring in a tax on, TV presenters, you could be on the first plane to Dubai and you could be doing your job there. But what happened when Russia invaded Ukraine and suddenly the British government decides it's going to tax Roman Abramovich, one of the biggest Russian billionaires who was at the time living in London? Okay, he's on the first flight to Moscow, but because he's a billionaire, what does he own? Chelsea Football Club, a massive football club here in London. Well, what do? We just freeze the asset, we freeze the cash flows. These very, very wealthy people, they own assets in your country. They own your land, they own your property, they own your mortgages. You can tax them whether they leave or not. Now, listen, if we were Chinese and we owned $10 billion of Chinese assets, and the Chinese government comes to us and says, well, where's the tax on those assets? And we say, oh, well, I live in New Zealand, I'm not paying it. They're going to take the tax anyway. These guys, these people are not making money from their work. They are making money because they own your country. They own your land, they own your natural resources, they own your property, they own your mortgages, they own your debt. You have to make a choice, basically. Do you want the people who own your country to pay tax or not to pay tax? And that's a choice that the New Zealand public can make. But if you choose to allow them not to pay tax, you cannot be surprised when the ordinary public becomes impoverished in the long term.
Chewie, I think you probably want or need to respond to that, because that's pretty good. We have a choice. Do we want them to pay tax or not? That's it. And I like when I say I like the idea, I sometimes do think the economies of scales don't really work, because Europe, obviously, the number of billionaires living in the UK is probably the same as the number of multi-millionaires living in New Zealand, or 100 millionaires in New Zealand. So it's not like many people in New Zealand own a $1 billion sports team, but the themes are still the same. I mean, not that he's around anymore. I'm not saying this to disparage him, but Michael Hill jeweler, when he was alive, he'd go, I'm going to go live in a better tax zone. But all his stores are still here, and all those profits that the stores are making are still paying tax. So there is still tax coming from that very wealthy person in New Zealand, even if he does take off. And that's, I think, what Gary's kind of saying, Chewie.
Do you want to check my screen up?
I can do that. I got that mine down first and then check yours up. There you go.
There we go. So this story came out recently. Millionaires don't flee states over higher tax. Increasing state taxes on wealthy raised revenue without triggering millionaire flight, new study has found. Now, this is in America. This is around taxation leveled by the states. Obviously, moving from one state to another state inside the same country, very, very easy. So if it's going to make things harder, you would just do it, right? Much easier than moving a whole country. A common counter to raising taxes on the rich is that they'll simply flee their home states to jurisdictions with friendlier tax codes. We've heard that here, right? Even from Chippy, he was worried about it. So in Massachusetts and Washington, people with a net worth of at least 7 figures continued to expand after tax hikes. The millionaire class has grown by 38.6% in Massachusetts and 46.9% in Washington over the past 2 years. The 7-figure clubs in those states saw their wealth grow by $580 million and $748 million respectively. Not only did millionaires not flee the states imposing new taxes, but the states themselves became richer. The 4% surtax on $1 million incomes in Massachusetts and the 7% tax on capital gains of $250,000 or more in Washington state succeeded in raising revenue $2.2 billion in the 2024 financial year and $1.2 billion in its first 2 years of implementation, respectively. But these guys might run. My argument is that if they're not pulling their fair share, let's see if they do.
I was just looking as well, because one of our podcasts, and I was just looking to see whether it was Gary or Gary or Craig, the myth of millionaire migration. That's what it is. So if you're watching us on YouTube, it's on this page right now. Maybe it's even I'll see if it's the first 60 seconds. Can you please not throw up in my studio, dog? What are you doing? Sheesh. Excuse me. Let's see what it's got to say at the very start, just in case it is the exact stat I'm thinking about.
A year or so ago, the British government said that it was going to roll back a set of rules that it had that were about people who lived outside the UK but still had UK tax residence. Under those rules, as they stood at the time, you could book income outside of the UK, and if that income wasn't generated in the UK, then you weren't subject to that taxation. And it meant that a lot of income that was being produced by UK citizens wasn't being taxed and not able to provide decent public services. That report received about 11,000 pieces of media coverage, not just in the UK, but around the world. It was very widely circulated. TJN, Tax Justice Network, dug into the numbers and found that the amount of millionaires that migrated from the UK that year under the threat of those non-dom changes came to 9,500 people, and that in terms of the context of the number of millionaires in the UK at the time, it was 0.3% of millionaires that moved.
So there you go. So, I mean, same thing in the UK. So all the threat of, if you're going to tax us differently, we're going to leave, 0.3% of millionaires in the UK did. Same thing. Same thing.
Yeah. I think it is something that is stirred up by people to stop this from happening. And those people are the property owning class, the people that are donating to the right-wing, low taxation parties and giving them such phenomenal war chests to compete in the marketplace of ideas, right?
Yeah.
And in elections and that sort of thing. Like, what, the right-wing parties have like 3, almost 4 times the amount of money to call on in the run-up to an election.
Yeah, maybe more.
And are we still comfortable in thinking that it is one person, one vote that is going to take the day? I am less and less comfortable with that as time goes on.
Yeah.
And we just seem to be like, we can't touch the rich people, they'll run away. We can't ask the rich people to pay their fair share because they'll fucking run away. So we'll just go after the people that can't run away, the middle income earners. We're going to tax you to fuck. And everything that you do is user pays. Everything that you buy is saved. You lucky enough to have some money to put aside. It's not enough money to buy a house, but maybe you invest it and put it in your KiwiSaver. We're going to tax that as well. We're going to tax that as well. All the guys at the top, they have the tools and resources to hide the money. They have enough money then to pay the people to run the government based on, you're not going to come after us, right, bro? Because there's an understanding here.
Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Yeah.
Yeah,
All right,
I'm furious about this.
Yeah, let's look at the last question. And basically, Gary goes on to explain how we are a wealthy country and individuals and citizens here should be wealthier.
Yes.
And it's often very popular for politicians to say they're going to cut tax. And I think New Zealand, similarly in some ways to Australia, was able to get away with that for a long time because it has very low population density, which means there's a lot of wealth there. Really, by rights, New Zealand should be a rich country because there's not a lot of people there. There's a phenomenal amount of natural wealth per person. It can sustain a good quality of life for every single person in the country. Yeah. The problem you have is once you start cutting those taxes on the richest, the rich very, very quickly start to increase their share of the wealth. And inevitably, that starts to squeeze people out. I think people in New Zealand, you should look at what happens to countries in Africa, Latin America, huge countries with enormous amounts of natural resources where people should be rich, but they allow inequality to spiral out of control. I think the problem you have is your ordinary person doesn't realize that if I cut inheritance tax for the very, very rich, then they will outcompete my kids for the house that they need. They don't realize that,
This is the other thing that Gary hits on quite so often. We've been saying this for a few months now. This idea about, equality of opportunities and all that sort of thing. All of that philosophy is based on the situation of if resources were unlimited. As soon as resources become limited, let's just think about housing. There's not an infinite number of houses. There's a set number of houses, and what's happening is the wealthy are eating up more and more and more and more and more of the percentage of those houses because there's a finite number. And then what happens is your kids, is what Gary said, is competing with wealthy people to buy that house. Your kids are trying to buy the first house. The wealthy person is trying to buy their 50th rental property. And when resources are limited, that's when the wealthy squeeze out. If you want to talk about resources being entrepreneurial spirit, sure. If you want to talk about it being cars, not so much, because cars are limited, whatever the resource is.
They think we live in an infinite economy. They don't realize that if you don't tax the rich will squeeze you out. And that's the whole reason why I've written my book, why I've got my YouTube channel, why I'm doing this talk with you now, why I'm coming to New Zealand. Because what I want to make people aware of is tax is not just about punishment. Tax is about protecting your share of the pie. If you accept a situation where the rich grow their share every year, then of course your share and your family's share will eventually be squeezed to nothing.
Pretty depressing. There was one other point as well, which I haven't got queued up, but I will fight it because I've written down on my notes, fight, 2748. And we'll just play this and see what he says. And we'll just play it from 2730 just to see. and we'll finish it at 27:58.
Ordinary man or woman on the street working a regular job, paying regular bills in a regular house. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm on YouTube. I want to speak to the public. You know, I do not think that the economists and the politicians, who in most cases are rich and comfortable, are going to give this to the British public or the New Zealand public. So I'm here to speak to the New Zealand public and tell them the fire engines are not coming. If you want to fix the economy, you need to demand this of your politicians. You need to demand this yourselves.
Yeah, fight. That's the end of Gary for tonight, Chewie. I do have one more. We have one more story to do, but is there anything you want to speak to of that to start with?
Look, every time we talk about Gary, I get fired up about the whole thing, and I think this is the danger, linking back to our other discussion about centrists. Centrists being slowly, let's not rock the boat. We are at a point where that is not going to do us any good. You know, we have all of these things that we've spoken about. Like, New Zealand is a wealthy country with a much lower population. We were able to keep the roads in good nick. We were able to have a rail network. We had coastal shipping. We built hospitals in major cities. Big projects. We built hydro dams, all of these sort of things. And we did that in a time where the wealthy were taxed properly. And everybody just went, I pay my taxes, I get services and infrastructure, and that's good enough. I don't understand the mindset of you average New Zealander, someone like me, that looks at the tax that they pay and think that this is fair and equitable. You know, I mentioned user pays, and that really set off a couple of people in the chats before. 100%. User pays was the scam of the 90s. Don't spread the load across the entire population. Just increase taxation for the people that use it. Brilliant. Sounds perfectly reasonable. If you have a head injury. Like, user pays, like, you quite often bring up the fact of Ruth Richardson having the idea of having cash registers in hospital emergency rooms and stuff like that. That's user pays, right? Yeah. You're the person that had the accident. Get your fucking wallet out. You're the person that uses the roads. Yes, every single person in this country gets the benefit of a road network, but we're only going to go after certain people. Like, it's madness. And I think if anybody is going to talk about let's get back on track, part of that is getting back to a tax system that works for the entirety of the country. And we can go back to saying, hey, look, we don't have any potholes in our road because we've got a roading budget that's enough. You know, we don't have to worry about freight nationwide because we've got a rail network that fucking works. And that's why our roads are in better nick now. Why we have new ferries. Our waiting lists for hospitals are down because we train enough nurses and we retain them, and we have enough GPs that make sure that people are happy, you're healthier and don't end up in hospital as much. But when they do end up in hospital, you know what? We've got a brand new hospital full of nurses that get holidays when they need them. And they were trained in universities, and they learned in schools that were well resourced, and all of this spirals. But why have we ended up here? And it's neoliberalism, and it's a 50-year experiment that is a failure, and we can see it in every single fucking country it was tried, especially in England. Thank you, Margaret Thatcher. It all happened at the same time. Everybody was reading the same fucking book.